Hi, and welcome to the Ministry Network podcast. I'm your host, James Baird. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming onto the show Dr. Russell Moore. Dr. Moore is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Today, we'll be talking with him about Christian leadership. The Ministry Network podcast is sponsored by Westminster Theological Seminary. To learn more about their online programs, visit ministrynetwork.com/degree. Now, let's talk with Dr. Moore. Well, obviously, the real testing fire for leadership is conflict. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the conflicts that you've faced, and then what tactics you've found to be effective in managing those conflicts?
Well, I think that one of the things that you have to recognize that, first of all, is that conflicts are going to come. You're not going to be in ministry without that. And if you think that that's not the case, you're deceived about that. What you have to do is to recognize you can't control what's going on in other people's minds and hearts. And one of the things that I've found in just seeing a certain kind of person who's quarrelsome and always in initiating a controversy with someone else is that usually there's a great deal of woundedness there, and it can be any number of things. And so often it's a cry for, pay attention to me. All sorts of things are going on in people's lives. You have to know that. And then you have to know human nature enough to know that that's the case. But I think what's most important is to guard your own heart to make sure that you are not, as Paul says to Timothy, a quarrelsome person or someone who has, again, as Paul says, an unhealthy craving for controversy. And so, again, you almost have to come in and say, what are my particular points of vulnerability? And how do I shore those things up? So I have some friends who would say to you that they really like mixing it up over whatever. They're the kind of people that would love just standing up and yelling about, who should have won the Super Bowl last year. And so those are people who have to say, okay, I really have to guard my heart against becoming a quarrelsome person who has that unhealthy craving for controversy. And it's easy, Paul puts sexual passion, immorality, right together with this craving for controversy. They're always talked about together. And so it's the same sort of thing. You can convince yourself, just like somebody in sexual immorality can convince themselves, oh, I'm in love, this is my soulmate, whatever. You can think that you're a warrior for Christ all of the time. So you have to know that about yourself. For me, my point of vulnerability is not that. I don't enjoy controversy at all. My point of vulnerability is paying attention to it. And so there's a certain amount of remove that you have to have in order to function in ministry, where you say to yourself, I'm not going to defend myself on everything. So if you go back to the youth ministry example, for instance, there were times when you have the sort of, I can't believe that these pagan kids are showing up at our church. There are times where what I wanted to do is to come in and say, sort of like the old country music song, Harper Valley PTA, and just start listing through what their own kids were doing. But your kids have learned how to spiritualize it and hide it. All that would have been doing, though, is defending myself and my ministry. And Jesus never called me to defend myself in my ministry. That's what Paul says, I consider it a small thing to be judged by you. Why? Not because he's not judged, but because he is giving an account at the judgment seat of Christ, and he can't even judge himself. So instead, what you have to do is to come in and say, okay, let me first of all ask, is there truth in what's being said here? Get counsel. Or is there something that I need to communicate better? Sometimes there is. And then sometimes you're going to conclude, no, the problem isn't that I'm communicating too poorly. The problem is I'm communicating too well. And then to come in and to differentiate between, you're going to have some people who are just trying to figure things out, and you help them along. You don't give it. And then you're going to have other people who really just want to have bait taken and want to be in a fight, and you have to not do that. So, I mean, if you notice the way that Jesus does in the Gospels, it's almost unpredictable, except for the fact that, as John says, he knows what's in the heart of humanity. So there are times when Jesus will stop and explain something. There are times when Jesus will turn the question around and talk about something that seems to be almost completely different. There are times when Jesus says, I'm not going to engage you in that. We don't have the perfect awareness of human nature that Jesus has, but that's what we ought to be aspiring to, is a spirit that's leading us to the point where we, as best as we can, are able to differentiate between, you may have, think of the difference in Galatians, for instance, between the way that Paul treats the Judaizers from the way that he treats Simon Peter in Galatians 2, from the way that he treats the members of the Galatian church who are bewitched and confused. They're very different ways of speaking to them. And that's very different from the way that he speaks to the Philippians. And if you confuse those things and you do them differently, then you're going to end up really creating a bad situation for everybody involved. And you're just there's a temptation, I think, for anybody in leadership of any kind, and maybe especially of ministry, just to become a hack, which is to say, who is this group in front of me? What do they already think and want me to say? And then just let me say it back to them. Well, that's not ministry. That's something else. That's politics of the lowest kind. And so you just have to be guarding yourself on that.
The two things that really stand out to me there are that these have been two themes throughout our conversation. One, you've got to understand who you're trying to reach. And two, you need to develop wisdom to know which direction you should push, prod, and lead them to go. And it strikes me that those are two things that take a lot of hard work and experience to develop. What advice would you have for someone who's very new to ministry and very aware that they haven't developed that repertoire yet?
Well, I would say a number of things. I mean, one of those things is and this sounds obvious, but it's not as obvious as we think, and that is spend a lot of time in Scripture. And what I've noticed is there was a little book on a Guide to the New Testament came out a year or two ago that said, we have a generation of Bible quoters and not Bible readers. And that immediately resonated with me because that's exactly what I was often facing in training ministers, is that you had people who knew a lot of the Bible in order to have the arguments they wanted to have about specific issues. So they knew why they were Calvinists and not Arminians or vice versa, or why they were complementarians and not egalitarians or vice versa. They knew all that, but they didn't know the difference between Jehoiakim and Josiah. And they wouldn't say this, but it almost seemed like that's a detail. Well, that's though how you're shaped and formed, and that's how by the Spirit you know what's going on. That the way that Jesus speaks to the devil in the wilderness is by quoting Scripture, but he's not quoting out of context passages. He's indicating, I know what storyline I'm in right now. I'm where Israel was in these particular places. And so that's necessary. And then also I would say learning from people, working alongside people, and you don't need to necessarily work along somebody that is excellent. All you have to do is pay attention. So, one of the most useful things to me was serving alongside, early on in my ministry, somebody who was not out of line spiritually or doctrinally, but just had a very different personality, very different leadership style, would make decisions completely the opposite of what I would make them about various things. And I learned to say, I'm going to submit to that leadership And it wasn't anything, had to do with anything with conscience or anything. But I'm going to submit to that leadership, and I'm going to pay attention to it. And what I found was to say, okay, why did he make that decision? And why would I not? And what I would find is often it's because he knew better than I did, all sorts of things. And so what I would want to do is to say, well, what does he know that I don't know? And then there are going to be other things that I would say, okay, I still don't think that I would do things that way. And here are the reasons why. And then, there have been times when maybe I came to that second conclusion, and then years later, I said, I see why he did it that way now. So just pay attention to those sorts of things.
That's so wonderful because especially when you're younger, it's so easy to mistake being very well spoken with actually understanding a situation.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And you honestly, one of the things that I think we have lost in the moment that we're in right now, I remember going around the room when I was teaching preaching and saying, who is the person who has been the most influential on your own preaching and ministry and so forth? And maybe one or two people would mention someone that they actually knew, and almost everyone else would talk about somebody from a very far distance. Well, I'm not saying there's not any value in learning from people from a far distance. That's why we're blessed to have the sort of media that we have, is what we're doing right now. But that's not all. A lot of what you have to learn has to be in the things that you're never going to see in any public presentation, which is how, I learned more about ministry from my boyhood pastor, watching the way that he would not freak out and panic about certain things, and the way that he would bear with certain things, and the fact that he was not one bit concerned about the sort of soap opera drama that can often happen in ministry that people sort of enjoy and they want to get you involved in. So, Brother Phaler, what do you think about the fact that Miss So-and-so said that your sermons are too dry or whatever, The fact that this wasn't somebody who would respond to that or to get involved in that, I learned a lot more from that than I would from anything I could consume. And a lot of that is they're not even things that you necessarily know that you're learning at the time. So I would say to somebody, don't worry about whether or not you have a notebook filled up with, here are the leadership lessons that I learned from serving at, Second Presbyterian Church of Springfield. It's a lot of it is just inclinations and intuitions that you pick up.
Character level change over time.
Yeah.
It's really helpful, really helpful. Have you faced any difficulties balancing leadership with family life? And what advice would you give to someone who's trying to have a healthy relationship to both?
I have, and one of the things that I had to learn early on is how to involve my wife and children in my ministry to the degree that I don't have separate sections of my life, but not to involve them at certain levels so that I could distinguish between myself and my ministry. And one of the ways that really came home to me, I have a friend who's a songwriter who was talking one time about his dad. And his dad was a doctor, and his dad would come home and just lock himself in his study. And what my friend said was, my dad was not a bad person. He just couldn't tell the difference between himself and his gift. And I remember that really hit me. And I said, I think I have trouble sometimes knowing the difference between myself and my gift. And one of the things that my children need from me is the ability to know the difference between those two things. And so sometimes one of the things that and again, this is going to be specific to the person, but one of the things that's helpful to me is to say, am I finding myself, when I'm talking to my kids or my wife, do I have a second narration running in the back of my head about whatever and why? Sometimes you are. That's going to happen. But to say, why is that the case? Pay attention to it. And if that's happening regularly, to say, well, how do I then address it? And to just work to separate yourself from that. And it doesn't matter how you can have a church of 4 people and you still can have this difficulty of differentiating between public persona. And that's one of the reasons why, my dad was a pastor's kid. And, you hear from a lot of pastors' kids this sense of being in the spotlight all the time. Some of that just has to do with the nature of church ministry, but I think some of it has to do with the sort of pressure that comes upon people in ministry or leadership to say, my family is an extension of me, and I'm defining me in terms of this ministry. Well, that's not the way that God has ordered us to be. It's to find our identity in Jesus Christ, and then all of this other flows out of that. And so just be watching that and noticing it.
One thing that I've noticed is there's certainly seasons in life whenever some event or some aspect of your role where in order to provide for the family, things have to shift and change. But I've also noticed that if those things keep happening, it's saying more about me and less about my ministry or my job. What am I doing to set up that sort of dynamic?
That's right. And you have to have people in your life who are close enough in to see what's happening, but far enough away that they can have some perspective on it. So I have had people in my life who there was a time in my life where someone said, "You're traveling too much," and started pointing out the fact I was doing a lot of traveling that was about, well, this person, I care about this person has invited me, he's discouraged in ministry and I want to encourage him. And I had someone from the outside say, you can encourage him different ways than, being gone from Friday to Sunday. And so you need people who are able to say those things to you sometimes.
I've noticed that the friends I like to hang out on Friday night with are people who aren't particularly hard-headed, they're open. But the people who give me the best advice are the people that are the hardest for me to convince I'm right.
Yes. Well, not only that, one of the best moments of counsel that I ever had was I had made a decision. It was not a huge decision, but it was a decision that I had made where I thought that I had handled it badly. I'd been too harsh when I shouldn't have been, as I should have been gentler than I was. And I just was thinking that through and thinking, I just failed in that. And a lot of people around me say, no, you didn't. You handled this fine. But I didn't believe them. It wasn't until I talked to this elderly man in ministry who said, yeah, let's just suppose you totally failed on that. What now? And he said, I think the problem that you have is pride because you're shocked that you could fail that way. And I think you should be less impressed with your failure. And that was one of the most liberating things anybody has ever said to me, apart from the preaching of the gospel, because I said, that's exactly right. So I think you need those sorts of...
And I found that oftentimes they don't even have to be right. This older gentleman sounds like he had the experience to just zero in on the situation. But a lot of times they don't even have to be right, but they force you to reframe what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and that's what he said. He didn't even say, you handled this well, you handled it badly. He said, let's just suppose you handled it horribly and that you did it the worst it could possibly be done. So what? And so in that way, what you're doing is not, because what I find sometimes when I'm getting counsel from somebody is that I'm thinking, yeah, but you don't know. You don't know this particular situation, or you don't know me. So it's sort of Nathaniel in John 1, when Jesus says, behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile. Nathaniel's response is, you don't even know who I am. Well, I'm not going to receive that as a compliment. It's not until Jesus says, I saw you under the fig tree. He's indicating, I do know you and I know your situation. That's an essential part of it.
Well, Dr. Moore, like me, you're a book lover. So I would love to hear, what are your favorite books on leadership and why do you enjoy them so much?
For me, actually, what's been most helpful in terms of leadership has not been quote unquote leadership books as much as it is good fiction. that can help you to understand and to know human nature, including situations that are far different from your own. That's been really helpful to me. And then also biographies. So looking through and seeing, for instance, one of the things that I notice, I just reread a biography of John Stott, who's somebody that I admire greatly. And just looking at those moments in John Stott's life where you're on the outside looking at the biography of a completed life, and you can think, this probably seemed awful at the moment. Whatever it was that was going on right now. You can see the end result, and he can't. Even just as a human being, that's been really helpful as well. And then again, I mentioned Seth Godin. His stuff has been really helpful in terms of the way that change happens and about that interplay between the familiar and the new. That's been helpful to me as well.
What are some of your favorite biographies?
Oh, I'll tell you, in recent years, probably my two favorite biographies have been multi-person biographies. So The Fellowship, which is about the Inklings that came out a few years ago, and then The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which is about Walker Percy and Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and Flannery O'Connor. So they're multi-person. The Inklings one is for people who were together a lot, but the other is not. They're just people who have these kind of momentary intersections. But that's been really helpful to me.
Yeah. I love how you said that it's those, you said fiction and biographies, which have been so huge, is because, a lot of times we like to just get the principle, what's the rule from the leadership guru that I need to apply? But by reading those stories and seeing those situations, you actually are building up a file in your mind of when you see a pattern and you recognize a type of dynamic, you can think through how different leaders have handled it in the past.
Yeah, and it's not just abstractions. Frederick Buechner talks about parables and about how there's this assumption that you can just come through and pull the abstract principles out of Jesus's parables and leave the rest of it like an orange rind. But that's not how they work. So it's not that you come in and say, okay, what's the principle behind the parable of the Good Samaritan? The lawyer to whom he's speaking already knew the principles. You had to involve him emotionally and mentally and intuitionally in this experience. Or David already knew, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not abuse your power. He knew all those things. Nathan had to come in and involve him in the story of the ewe lamb in order to turn around and say, this is you.
And that's a theme that I think has gone through our whole conversation. That's reading a parable for the information instead of reading it for formation.
Yeah.
And people want the quick tips on leadership, but it is all about formation.
Right.
Well, which leaders from history do you look up to the most and why?
I look up to Irenaeus early on. Even before that, biblically, I resonate a lot with Simon Peter just because I can see those places of confusion that would no doubt be my own, except more so, and the patience with which Jesus treats him, the directness and patience together. There, Irenaeus is important to me. Augustine, C.S. Lewis, as I mentioned, is pivotal in my life and always is. You go through seasons where certain people come in and out, but he never goes out. He's been with me since reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or having it read to me as a 2-year-old, right to this morning. So that's someone who's been important in my life as well.
Dr. Moore, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on Ministry Network.
Well, thanks for having me, and blessings to you.
Tomorrow, we're releasing a special edition episode with Dr. Stephen Nichols, where we'll talk about his new biography, R.C. Sproul, A Life. Also, don't forget to visit ministrynetwork.com/degree to learn about the new online offerings available at Westminster Theological Seminary.